I wonder if you know what you want to be when you grow up. Some people know even when they're as young as you are, and others don't know even when they're grown up. Very often, of course, we change our minds as we get older, but not always. My wife, she knew that she wanted to be a teacher even when she was about 5 years old, and she was. I'm going to tell you a story about 3 trees, and they knew exactly what they wanted to be when they grew up. The first tree looked up at the stars, twinkling like diamonds in the sky above him. "I want to hold treasure," he said. "I want to be covered with gold and filled with precious stones. I will be the most beautiful treasure chest in the whole wide world." The second tree looked out at a small stream as it trickled by on its way to the ocean. "I want to be a strong sailing ship," he said. "I want to travel mighty waters and carry powerful kings. I will be the strongest ship in the world." The third tree looked down to the valley below, where busy men and busy women were working in a busy town. And she said, "I don't want to leave this mountain top at all. I want to grow so tall that when people stop to look at me, they will raise their eyes to heaven and think of God. I will be the tallest tree in the whole wide world." Well, the years passed. The rains came and the sun shone and the trees grew. One day, 3 woodcutters climbed the mountain. The first woodcutter looked at the first tree and said, "This tree is beautiful. It's perfect for me." And with a swoop of his shining axe, the first tree fell. "Now I shall be made into a beautiful chest," thought the first tree. "I shall hold wonderful treasures." The second woodcutter looked at the second tree and said, "This tree is strong. It's perfect for me." And with a swoop of his shining axe, the second tree fell. "Now I shall sail mighty waters," thought the second tree. "I shall be a strong ship fit for kings." The third tree felt her heart sink when the last woodcutter looked at her. Well, he didn't even really look at her, he just looked away, and she stood straight and tall and pointed bravely to heaven, but the woodcutter didn't even look up. "Any kind of tree will do for me," he murmured. And with a swoop of his shining axe, the third tree fell. The first tree rejoiced when the woodcutter brought him into a carpenter's shop. But the busy carpenter was not thinking about treasure chests. Instead, his work-worn hands fashioned the tree into a feed box for animals. The once beautiful tree was not covered with gold or filled with treasure. He was coated with sawdust and filled with hay for hungry farm animals. The second tree smiled when the woodcutter brought him into a shipyard. But no mighty ships were being made there that day. Instead, the once strong tree was hammered and sawn into a simple fishing boat. He was too small and too weak to sail a mighty ocean. Instead, he was taken to a lake, and every day his deck was filled with smelly fish. The third tree was confused because the woodcutter cut her into big strong beams and then just left her in a wood store. "What happened?" she thought to herself. "All I ever wanted to do was to stay on the mountaintop and point to God." Well, many days and nights passed, and the 3 trees nearly forgot their dreams. But one night, golden starlight poured over the first tree as a young woman placed her newborn baby into the feed box. "I wish I could make a cradle for him," her husband whispered. The mother squeezed his hand and smiled as the starlight shone on the smooth and sturdy wood and on the baby Jesus. "This manger is perfect," she said. And suddenly The first tree knew that he was holding the greatest treasure in the world. Some more years passed, and one evening a tired traveller and his friends crowded into the old fishing boat. The traveller fell asleep, and as the second tree quietly sailed out across the lake, suddenly a thundering and a crashing storm arose. The tree shuddered. He knew that he didn't have the strength to carry so many passengers safely through the wind and the rain. The men in the boat were worried too. "Jesus, wake up!" they shouted. He stood up, stretched out his hand and said, "Peace, be still." The storm suddenly stopped as quickly as it had begun. And the second tree knew that he was carrying the King of heaven and earth. A couple of years later, on a Friday morning, the third tree was startled when her beams were pulled out from the forgotten woodpile. She flinched as she was carried through an angry, jeering crowd. She shuddered as when soldiers nailed a man's hand to her. She felt ugly and harsh and cruel. But on Sunday morning, when the sun rose, the earth trembled with joy because the crucified man, Jesus, had come back to life. The third tree knew that God's love had changed everything. It had made the first tree beautiful. It had made the second tree strong. And every time people thought of the third tree, they would think of God's love, because God loved the world and everything in it so much that he sent his only son, Jesus, so that anybody who believes in him and trusts him will have eternal life. So that's the story of the three trees. Obviously, the story about the trees is a made-up story because, as far as we know, trees can't think and they don't have feelings. But the reliability of the historical facts of Jesus' birth and crucifixion are beyond any reasonable doubt. And the case for his coming back to life is pretty convincing too.